I've been driving trucks for 30 years and I've seen things on the road that would make your skin crawl. But nothing compares to what happened to me on that foggy night in October. It's the reason I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, and why I always keep my doors locked, even when I'm rolling down an empty highway at 3 a.m. It was just past midnight when I pulled out of the truck stop outside of Tulsa. The fog was thicker than pea soup, but I had a deadline to meet in Kansas City, so I couldn't afford to wait it out. I'd been on the road for about an hour when I first saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing on the shoulder of the highway. In the split second my headlights caught her, I saw a young woman with long, dark hair, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. She had her thumb out, hitchhiking. Now, I'm not the type to pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about her made me pull over. Maybe it was the way she looked so out of place on that lonely stretch of road, or maybe it was just that I was tired and wanted some company to keep me awake. Whatever it was, I found myself easing my rig onto the shoulder. I opened the passenger door and she climbed in without a word. Up close, I could see that she was beautiful, but there was something off about her. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, and her eyes seemed to reflect the light like a cat's. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. "North," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "As far as you can take me." I nodded and pulled back onto the highway. The cab filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the swish of the wipers fighting against the fog. After a few miles, I tried to make conversation. "So, what's your name?" She turned to look at me, and for a moment I swear her eyes glowed in the darkness. "Sarah," she said. "My name is Sarah." "Nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Tom. What brings you out here in the middle of the night?" She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then just as I was about to give up and turn on the radio, she spoke. "I'm trying to get home," she said. "I've been trying for a very long time." There was something in her voice that sent a chill down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and focused on the road ahead. As we drove, the fog seemed to get thicker. I could barely see 20 feet in front of the truck. The white lines on the road disappeared into the mist, and it felt like we were floating in a sea of gray. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:17 a.m. I had been driving for nearly 2 hours since I picked her up, but something didn't feel right. We should have been closer to Kansas City by now. I looked over at Sarah, intending to ask if she knew how far we were from the city, but the words died in my throat. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her skin seemed even paler than before, almost glowing in the dim light of the cab. "Sarah?" I said, my voice shaking slightly. "You okay?" She turned to me slowly, and I had to stifle a gasp. Her eyes were completely black, like two pools of oil in her face. "We're almost there," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "Almost where?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed straight ahead. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. Through the fog, I could see the faint outline of a bridge, but it wasn't any bridge I recognized, and I knew this route like the back of my hand. This bridge was old, made of rusted iron and weathered wood. It looked like something out of the 1920s, not a modern highway overpass. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just before the bridge. Sarah didn't move, her arms still outstretched, pointing at the ghostly structure before us. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, turning to face her. "Where are we?" But Sarah was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she'd never been there at all. The only sign that she'd existed was a damp spot on the seat where she had been sitting. My hands shaking, I reached for the CB radio. "Breaker 1-9, this is Big Tom. I'm on I-35 north of Tulsa, and I've got a situation here. Can anybody read me?" Nothing but static answered me. I tried again and again, but there was no response. It was like the whole world had disappeared, leaving me alone with this impossible bridge and the memory of a girl who wasn't there. I sat there for what felt like hours, engine idling, staring at the bridge through the fog. I couldn't bring myself to drive across it, but I couldn't turn back either. I was paralyzed by fear and confusion. As the first light of dawn began to penetrate the fog, I heard a sound that made my heart leap into my throat. It was the wail of a horn, old and mournful, like something from a steamship. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the bridge. And then I saw them. Ghostly figures, dozens of them, walking across the bridge towards my truck. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes like something out of a black-and-white movie. And leading them was Sarah, her white dress billowing around her as she walked. I wanted to run, to put the truck in gear and floor it in the opposite direction, but I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of these spectral figures approaching my rig. They passed through the truck as if it wasn't there, their faces blank and eyes unseeing. Sarah was the last to pass. She paused for a moment, turning to look at me through the windshield. Her black eyes met mine, and I heard her voice in my head as clearly as if she was sitting next to me. "Thank you for the ride, Tom," she said. "We've been waiting a long time to cross over." And then she was gone, disappearing into the fog with the others. As soon as she vanished, it was like a spell had been broken. The fog lifted suddenly, revealing the familiar highway stretching out before me. The old bridge was gone, replaced by the modern overpass I knew should be there. My CB radio crackled to life, filling the cab with the chatter of other drivers starting their morning routes. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a dream, some kind of hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But I knew better. I put the truck in gear and slowly pulled back onto the highway. As I passed under the overpass, I couldn't help but look up, half expecting to see the ghostly figures walking above me. But there was nothing there except concrete and steel. I made it to Kansas City later that morning, my cargo intact but my mind in shambles. I told my story to a few other drivers at the depot, but most of them laughed it off or assumed I'd been drinking. Only one old-timer, a guy who'd been driving these routes since the 60s, seemed to take me seriously. "You're not the first to see her, you know," he told me over a cup of coffee. "That stretch of highway was built over an old road, one that used to cross the river on a bridge that collapsed back in '38. Took a busload of people with it. They say some of them are still trying to make their way home." I nodded, not sure if I felt better or worse knowing that others had experienced something similar. "What do you think it means?" I asked him. He shrugged, his weathered face thoughtful. "Maybe they just needed someone to help them cross over. And you were the one who stopped." I've thought about that night 1,000 times since then. I've driven that stretch of highway in all kinds of weather, at all hours of the day and night. I've never seen Sarah or the others again. But sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I swear I can hear the faint sound of that old horn in the distance. And every time I pass that overpass, I say a little prayer for Sarah and the others. I hope they finally made it home, wherever that may be. As for me, I'll keep driving these roads, carrying my cargo and my memories. Because out here on the highway, you never know what might be waiting around the next bend. And sometimes, just sometimes, a simple act of kindness can echo across time itself. I've heard a lot of strange things come through my CB radio over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for the voice that crackled through my speakers on that moonless night in the Mojave Desert. It was a voice that shouldn't have existed, a voice that had been silenced years ago on the very stretch of road I was traveling, and it was calling for help. The night started like any other. I was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, a route I'd driven 100 times before. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of the highway, a sea of darkness broken only by the occasional glimmer of my headlights catching a piece of roadside trash or a startled jackrabbit. I had the radio on low, half listening to the chatter of other truckers making their way through the night. It was mostly the usual stuff. Warnings about speed traps, complaints about dispatchers, and the occasional dirty joke. Nothing to write home about. It was just past midnight when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just static, the kind you get when you're between transmitters. But then I caught a snippet of words, garbled and distorted like they were coming from very far away. "Help! Anyone hear me?" I reached for the volume knob, cranking it up. The voice came again, a little clearer this time. "This is Nighthawk. Trapped. Mile marker 109. Anyone copy?" I felt a chill run down my spine. Mile marker 109 was just a few miles ahead of me, but there was nothing there except sand and scrub brush. No buildings, no rest stops, not even a turnoff. Just an endless stretch of empty highway. I keyed the mic. "This is Big Red. I copy you, Nighthawk. What's your situation?" There was a long pause, filled with nothing but the hiss of static. I was about to try again when the voice came back, clearer than before. "Big Red, thank God, my rig overturned. I'm pinned. Can't get out. Need help fast." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my palms suddenly sweaty. "Copy that, Nighthawk. I'm about 5 minutes out from your location. Hang tight, I'm on my way." I pushed the accelerator down, the big diesel engine roaring as I sped up. In the back of my mind, something was nagging at me. Something about this whole situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. As I approached mile marker 109, I slowed down, scanning the roadside for any sign of an overturned truck. But there was nothing. The highway stretched out straight and empty in both directions, no sign of an accident or even recent tire marks on the shoulder. I keyed the mic again. "Nighthawk, this is Big Red. I'm at mile marker 109, but I don't see you. Can you give me a more precise location?" The response came immediately, the voice sounding more desperate than before. "I'm here. I'm right here. Can't you see the lights? Please, hurry." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There were no lights, no truck, nothing but the empty desert night. And then it hit me. I remembered why this all felt so wrong. I'd heard about this stretch of road before from other drivers. They called it the Ghost Mile because of what had happened here 10 years ago. A trucker, call sign Nighthawk, had run off the road at mile marker 109. His truck had overturned, pinning him in the cab. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The official report said he'd been calling for help on his CB for hours, but no one had heard him. My hands were shaking as I keyed the mic again. "Nighthawk, what's your real name?" There was a long pause, longer than any of the others. When the voice came back, it was different, colder somehow. "You know who I am, Big Red. You all know, but you didn't listen. You didn't come." I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, even though I knew it was irrational. I hadn't even been driving back then. Hell, I'd been in high school when it happened, but still, the accusation in that ghostly voice cut deep. "I'm sorry," I said, not sure what else to say. "We're sorry. We should have heard you." "Sorry doesn't change anything," the voice replied. "Sorry doesn't get me out of this cab. Sorry doesn't bring me home to my family." I didn't know how to respond to that. What could I say to a ghost, to a man who had died alone and afraid on this very stretch of road? What can I do?" I finally asked. The laughter that came through the speakers was hollow and bitter. "Do? You can listen, Big Red. That's all any of us ever wanted, someone to listen." And so I listened. For the next hour, as I sat there in my idling truck at mile marker 109, Nighthawk talked. He told me about his life, about the wife and kids he'd left behind. He told me about his last run, about how he'd been pushing too hard, trying to make up time, how he'd felt his eyes getting heavy, how he'd thought he could make it just a few more miles. He told me about the moment he'd felt the truck start to drift, about the split second of terror as he realized what was happening. And he told me about the long hours afterward, pinned in the wreckage, calling desperately for help that never came. As he talked, I felt tears running down my face. I'd never met this man, never even heard his real name. But in that moment, I felt like I knew him better than I knew myself. Finally, as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Nighthawk's voice began to fade. "Thank you for listening, Big Red," he said, his voice growing fainter with each word. "That's all I ever wanted, just someone to hear me." And then he was gone. The radio filled with static and then silence. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun rise over the desert, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road and too little sleep. But I knew better. I'd heard Nighthawk's voice, felt the pain and loneliness in his words. It had been real as anything I'd ever experienced. I finally put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. As I passed mile marker 109, I glanced at the spot where Nighthawk's truck must have left the road all those years ago. There was nothing there now, not even a scar in the earth to mark the spot where a man had died. But I knew something had changed, not just for me, but for Nighthawk too. He'd finally been heard, finally been listened to, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to let him rest. I've driven that stretch of road many times since that night. I've never heard Nighthawk's voice again, but I always slow down at mile marker 109. I always take a moment to remember, to listen to the silence and think about the man who died there. And every time I key my mic, every time I reach out into the night to talk to my fellow drivers, I remember the lesson Nighthawk taught me. The importance of listening, really listening, to the voices that come through the static. Because you never know when someone out there in the darkness might desperately need to be heard. So if you're ever driving through the Mojave at night and you hear a strange voice on your CB calling for help, don't ignore it. Don't assume it's a prank or a hallucination. Take a moment to listen, to really hear what's being said. Because out here on the lonely highways, sometimes a willing ear can make all the difference in the world. And who knows? You might just help a lost soul find its way home. I've seen a lot of truck stops in my 20 years on the road, but I'll never forget the night I stumbled upon Exit 13. It was a place that shouldn't have existed, a relic from another time that seemed to appear out of nowhere in the dead of night. And what happened to me there? Well, let's just say it's the reason I never drive past midnight anymore. It was a brutal haul, Minneapolis to Phoenix, and I was running behind schedule. The sun had set hours ago, and I was pushing through the endless dark of the New Mexico desert, my eyes straining against the monotony of the road ahead. The fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low, and I knew I needed to find a place to fill up soon or risk being stranded in the middle of nowhere. That's when I saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance, promising gas, food, and lodging. Exit 13, it said. I'd driven this stretch of I-40 100 times and never noticed this exit before, but I was too tired and desperate to question my good luck. I took the exit, the old truck rattling as I slowed down. The access road was rough, like it hadn't been maintained in years. As I approached the truck stop, I felt a strange sense of unease creeping over me. The place looked old, not just run down, but like something out of a different era entirely. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an eerie blue glow over a handful of ancient-looking pumps. Behind them stood a squat, weathered building with peeling paint and windows so grimy I couldn't see inside. A few old rigs were parked off to the side, their chrome dull and rusted. I didn't see any other drivers around. I pulled up to one of the pumps, the gravel crunching under my tires. The silence when I cut the engine was absolute. No highway noise, no distant traffic, just the low hum of the neon sign and the faint whisper of desert wind. I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the gravel with a crunch that seemed too loud in the stillness. The air felt wrong somehow, heavy and static, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I shivered despite the lingering heat of the day. As I reached for the pump, I noticed something odd. The price per gallon was listed as 65 cents. I blinked, sure I must be seeing things, but the number didn't change. Maybe it was some kind of retro gimmick, I thought, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness. I filled up quickly, eager to get back on the road. But as I replaced the nozzle, I realized I'd need to go inside to pay. I hesitated, looking at the dark, uninviting building. Part of me wanted to just drive off, to put this strange place in my rearview mirror and never look back. But I'm not a thief, and besides, something told me I wouldn't get far if I tried to run. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The interior was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes, revealing a space that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Faded linoleum floors, formica countertops, and wood-paneled walls surrounded a few scattered tables and a long counter with chrome stools. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as old and weathered as the building itself. His skin was pale and papery, his eyes sunken and dull. He didn't look up as I approached, just stared blankly at a point somewhere behind me. "Evening," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "Just need to pay for some gas." The old man's eyes slowly focused on me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something empty about his gaze, like looking into the eyes of a dead fish. "Pump number?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. 3, I replied, fighting the urge to back away. "Listen, is everything okay here? This place seems a little off." The old man's face didn't change, but I swear I saw something flicker in those dead eyes. "Everything's fine, sir. That'll be $13.65 for the gas." I handed over a 20, noticing as I did that my hand was shaking slightly. The old man's fingers were ice cold as they brushed against mine, and I had to suppress a shudder. As he slowly counted out my change, I glanced around the store. The shelves were sparsely stocked with products I didn't recognize, brands I'd never heard of. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On a rack near the door was a stack of newspapers. The headline caught my eye. Nixon resigns. The date on the paper was August 9th, 1974. I blinked hard, sure I must be hallucinating. But when I looked again, the paper was still there, still dated nearly 50 years in the past. Is this some kind of joke? I asked, my voice shaking. What's going on here? The old man looked at me blankly. I'm afraid I don't understand, sir. Is there a problem with your purchase? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was a low, mournful moan coming from somewhere in the back of the store. It sounded almost human, but distorted somehow, like a voice heard through water. What was that? I demanded, backing towards the door. What the hell is going on here? The old man's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow darker, deeper, like bottomless pits opening up in his face. You shouldn't ask questions you don't want answered, driver, he said, his voice suddenly different, deeper, resonant, filled with a terrible kind of knowledge. Some things are better left unknown. The moan came again, louder this time, accompanied by a shuffling sound. I saw movement in the shadows at the back of the store, something large and misshapen emerging from the darkness. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, bursting out of the store and sprinting for my truck. Behind me, I heard the moaning grow louder, mixed now with a horrible wet slapping sound like bare feet on linoleum. I scrambled into the cab, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, tires squealing as I peeled out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the store. Something big and wrong, its proportions all twisted and inhuman. I looked away quickly, focusing on the road ahead, pushing the accelerator to the floor. I didn't slow down until I was back on the interstate. The truck stopped far behind me. My heart was pounding, my shirt soaked with sweat. I kept expecting to see headlights in my mirror, to hear that terrible moaning again, but there was nothing but the empty night behind me. As the miles rolled by and the adrenaline began to fade, I started to doubt my own memories. Had it really happened? Could I have imagined it all, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion? But then I felt something in my pocket. I reached in with trembling fingers and pulled out the change the old man had given me. In the dim light of the dashboard, I could see the dates on the coins, 1972, 1969, 1963. And mixed in with them was something else, a small tarnished key with a faded plastic tag attached. The tag read, Room 13. I threw the coins and the key out the window, watching in the mirror as they vanished into the darkness. I drove through the rest of the night without stopping, not even for coffee or a bathroom break. I didn't feel safe until the sun came up, burning away the shadows and the memories of that terrible place. I've never been able to find Exit 13 again. I've looked for it in the light of day, but there's no trace of it on any map, no record of a truck stop at that location. Sometimes I manage to convince myself it was all a dream, a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But then I'll be driving at night and I'll see a flickering light in the distance or catch a whiff of that stale, musty air that filled the store. And I'll remember the sound of that moan, the sight of that thing emerging from the shadows, and I'll push the accelerator a little harder, racing towards the dawn, trying to outrun the darkness and the things that live in it. So if you're ever driving through New Mexico late at night and you see a sign for Exit 13, just keep on driving. Don't let your curiosity or your empty gas tank tempt you. Because some places aren't meant to be found, and some things are better left in the shadows where they belong. They say curiosity killed the cat, but they never mention what happens to the curious trucker. I found out the hard way when I joined that pitch-black convoy on a moonless night in the Ozarks. What I saw, where they led me, it's the reason I don't drive after sunset anymore, and why the sound of a diesel engine in the dark still makes me break out in a cold sweat. It was supposed to be a routine run, St. Louis to Little Rock, a drive I'd done 100 times before, but this time everything was different. I'd gotten a late start due to some mechanical issues, and by the time I hit the Arkansas state line, it was well past midnight. The road ahead was pitch black, my headlights the only illumination for miles around. I was fighting to keep my eyes open, the white lines on the road hypnotizing in their endless repetition. The radio was nothing but static, and I was seriously considering pulling over at the next rest stop to catch a few hours of sleep. That's when I saw them. At first, it was just a pinprick of light in my rearview mirror, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. But as I watched, it grew larger, resolving into a pair of headlights. Then another, and another. Within minutes, a convoy of trucks materialized behind me, their black paint jobs making them almost invisible in the darkness. I couldn't make out any logos or company names, just sleek, dark shapes looming in my mirrors. I keyed my mic, trying to hail them on the CB. "Breaker 1, 9, this is Big Joe. Anyone in that convoy got their ears on?" Nothing but static answered me. I tried again, but the silence was absolute. As I watched, the lead truck in the convoy began to pull alongside me. Its windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see the driver, but I got the distinct impression I was being scrutinized. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. A deep, gravelly voice came through the speakers, sending a chill down my spine. "Join us, Big Joe," it said. "We've got a long way to go and the night is young." I hesitated. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to floor it, to get away from these strange, silent trucks and their mysterious drivers. But there was something compelling about that voice, something that tugged at me in a way I couldn't explain. Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself easing off the gas, allowing the black truck to pass me. As it pulled in front, its brake lights flashed twice. An invitation. I took a deep breath and flashed my lights in response. Just like that, I was part of the convoy. We drove for what felt like hours, our trucks moving in perfect synchronization. I lost all sense of time and direction, aware only of the endless ribbon of road ahead and the looming presence of the other trucks around me. The landscape began to change, the familiar hills and forests of Arkansas giving way to something different. The trees became twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. The moon, which had been hidden all night, suddenly appeared, hanging low and bloated in the sky, casting an eerie red glow over everything. I blinked hard, sure I must be hallucinating. This couldn't be Arkansas. Hell, this couldn't be anywhere I'd ever seen before. Just as I was about to hit the brakes and demand some answers, the convoy began to slow. We turned off the main highway onto a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead straight into the heart of a dense, mist-shrouded forest. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches scraping against the sides of my truck. I could have sworn I saw faces in the gnarled bark, eyes watching our passage with ancient, hungry expressions. Finally, we emerged into a clearing. What I saw there made my breath catch in my throat. It was a truck stop, but like no truck stop I'd ever seen before. The buildings were constructed of some kind of black stone that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, glowing with a faint, pulsing light. The fuel pumps were tall and spindly, looking more like ancient monoliths than anything designed to dispense diesel. And the trucks? God, the trucks. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all black as night, all identical to the ones in our convoy. They were arranged in a vast circle around the truck stop, like some kind of unholy congregation. As we pulled in, I saw movement. Dark figures emerged from the other trucks, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They weren't human, couldn't be human. Their proportions were all wrong, too tall, too thin, with too many joints in their limbs. The voice from the radio came again, louder now, seeming to emanate from everywhere at once. "Welcome, brothers and sisters of the long haul. Welcome to the Midnight Depot." I sat frozen in my cab, unable to move, unable to breathe. What was this place? What were these things? A tapping on my window made me jump. I turned to see one of the dark figures standing there, its featureless face inches from the glass. Slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand and beckoned to me. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to floor it and never look back. But my body wasn't listening. As if in a trance, I found myself opening the door and stepping down from the cab. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been for an Arkansas night. It smelled wrong too, like ozone and decay and something else I couldn't identify. Something old. The dark figure glided away, clearly expecting me to follow. As I walked, I saw other drivers emerging from their trucks. Some moved confidently, like they'd done this 100 times before. Others stumbled and shook, as confused and terrified as I was. We were led to the central building, its doors opening silently at our approach. Inside was a vast circular room, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. At the center stood a podium, and behind it, I can't describe what I saw there. My mind refuses to process it, to put it into words. All I know is that when it spoke, its voice the same one I'd heard on the radio, I understood why we'd been brought here. We were being offered a choice, a bargain, endless miles, never-failing engines, cargo that always arrived on time, in exchange for something precious, something we could never get back. I'd like to say I was strong, that I refused the offer, that I turned and ran back to my truck and somehow found my way home. But the truth is, I don't know what I did. I don't remember anything after that moment, not until I found myself back on the highway, the sun rising over familiar Arkansas hills. My logbook showed I'd lost an entire day. My cargo was delivered, the paperwork signed, but I have no memory of doing it. And when I looked in the mirror, my face was different, older, like I'd aged years in a single night. I quit trucking after that, sold my rig, took a job at a local warehouse. I tell myself it was all a dream, a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But sometimes late at night I hear the rumble of diesel engines outside my window. And in the morning there are always tire tracks in my driveway, big ones like those left by a semi. They're calling me back, I think. The midnight convoy, the midnight depot, whatever deal I made there, whatever I agreed to, they're not done with me yet. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see a convoy of black trucks in your rearview mirror, don't slow down. Don't join them, no matter how tempting it might be. Keep driving. Push through until dawn. Because once you join the midnight convoy, once you've seen the midnight depot, you're never really free again. And somewhere out there, on a road that doesn't exist on any map, they're waiting for me, waiting for you, waiting for any driver lonely or desperate or curious enough to follow them into the dark. They say you can't outrun your fate, but I never thought mine would catch up to me on an endless stretch of highway. 40 years behind the wheel, and I thought I'd seen it all. But my last run, the one that was supposed to be my ticket to retirement, it turned into a nightmare that's still unfolding, a journey without end that's taught me the true meaning of eternity. It was supposed to be simple. One last cross-country haul from Miami to Seattle, then hang up my keys and settle into a quiet life of fishing and watching the grandkids grow up. I'd already lined up a buyer for my rig, an eager young driver named Tommy who reminded me of myself back when I first started out. The load was nothing special, just a trailer full of electronics bound for some big tech company up in Washington. I'd done this run 100 times before, could practically drive it with my eyes closed, but something felt different right from the start. It was the dispatcher, Marge. I'd known her for years, but when I called in to confirm the pickup, her voice sounded off, strained, like she was fighting back tears. "You sure you want to take this one, Frank?" she asked. "We could assign it to someone else, give you a nice, easy local run to finish out on." I laughed it off. "Come on, Marge, you know me. I want to go out with a bang, not a whimper. One last cross-country adventure before I retire to my rocking chair." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Marge spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "All right, Frank, if you're sure, just be careful out there, okay? And Frank, it's been an honor working with you all these years." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. It sounded less like a goodbye and more like a farewell, but I shook it off. Pre-retirement jitters, that's all it was. I picked up the load without a hitch and hit the road just as the sun was setting. The first leg of the journey was smooth sailing, clear skies, light traffic, and that sense of freedom that only comes from an open road and a full tank of diesel. It wasn't until I hit the Georgia state line that things started to get weird. I noticed a car in my rearview mirror, a sleek black sedan that seemed to be keeping pace with me no matter how I varied my speed. At first I thought it might be a cop running silent, but hours passed and it never made a move to pull me over. As night fell, I started to feel uneasy. The sedan was still there, always at the same distance, never getting closer or falling behind. And now that it was dark, I could see that its headlights were wrong somehow. Too bright, with a bluish tinge that made my eyes water when I glanced in the mirror. I tried to shake it off, cranking up the radio and focusing on the road ahead. But as the miles rolled by, other strange things started happening. My GPS went haywire, showing me in places I knew I couldn't be. The clock on my dashboard seemed to be running backwards. And the few other vehicles I saw on the road, well, they didn't look quite right. Older models, styles I hadn't seen on the road in years. By the time I hit Tennessee, I was thoroughly spooked. I decided to pull over at the next truck stop, get some coffee, maybe chat with some other drivers to calm my nerves. But as I took the exit, I realized something was very, very wrong. The truck stop looked like something out of a time warp. Ancient gas pumps, a diner with a neon sign straight out of the 1950s, and not a single modern vehicle in sight. As I pulled in, every head turned to stare at me. The people, they looked wrong. Pale, with sunken eyes and clothes that seemed to belong to another era entirely. I didn't even shut off the engine. I put the truck in gear and got the hell out of there, my heart pounding in my chest. What the fuck was going on? Back on the highway, things only got stranger. The landscape outside my windows began to shift and change in impossible ways. One moment I was driving through the rolling hills of Tennessee. The next I was in a desert that looked like it belonged on another planet. The sky above turned colors I'd never seen before, swirling patterns that made my head spin if I looked at them too long. And always, that black sedan was behind me. I drove for what felt like days, weeks, maybe even months. I lost all sense of time, all sense of where I was or where I was going. The only constants were the endless road ahead and the cargo in my trailer. I tried to stop, to turn around, but every time I did, something would happen to force me back on the road. A bridge would collapse behind me, or a sinkhole would open up, or a landslide would block the way back. My fuel gauge never dropped below half full. My body never seemed to need food or sleep, and no matter how far I drove, I never seemed to get any closer to Seattle. Somewhere in what might have been Idaho, or maybe it was the surface of Mars, at that point I couldn't tell the difference. I finally broke down. I pulled over to the side of the road, put my head in my hands, and wept like a child. That's when I heard the tap on my window. I looked up to see a man standing there. He was tall and thin, dressed in an immaculate black suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. His face, I couldn't focus on his face. Every time I tried, my eyes would slide away like they were refusing to process what they were seeing. "Hello, Frank," he said, his voice somehow inside my head rather than coming through the window. "I think it's time we had a chat." I don't remember opening the door, but suddenly he was sitting in my passenger seat. Up close, he smelled like ozone and old books. "What's happening to me?" I whispered. "What is all this?" The man, if he was a man, smiled. At least I think he smiled. It was hard to tell with a face like that. "You're fulfilling your contract, Frank," he said. "The one you signed all those years ago when you first started driving. Don't you remember?" "I'll drive until the day I die," you said. "This is what I was born to do." And suddenly I did remember. A truck stop much like the one I'd seen earlier, a stranger with a contract, the promise of a life on the road in exchange for... what? I couldn't remember the details, but I knew I'd agreed to something. "But I was retiring," I protested. "I was done. This was supposed to be my last run." The man shook his head. "Oh, Frank, it is your last run. Your very last run. The one that never ends." As he spoke, I felt a chill settle into my bones. I looked at my hands, really looked at them for the first time in... how long? They were gnarled and spotted with age, the hands of a man far older than my 65 years. "How long have I been driving?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Time doesn't mean much on this road," the man said. "But if I had to guess, about 100 years, give or take a decade." I felt the world spin around me. 100 years? It wasn't possible, and yet, what about my family, my grandkids? The man's expression might have been pity, or it might have been amusement. It was hard to tell. "They're long gone, Frank, but don't worry, you'll see them again. Eventually, when your contract is up." "And when will that be?" I asked, already dreading the answer. The man stood up, straightening his immaculate suit. "That's up to you, Frank. You're the one behind the wheel. Just keep driving. You'll get there someday." And then he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of ozone and the overwhelming sense of the miles yet to come. I sat there for a long time, staring at the impossible landscape outside my window. Part of me wanted to just give up, to step out of the truck and let whatever was out there take me. But in the end, I did what I've always done, what I was born to do, what I sold my soul to do. I put the truck in gear, checked my mirrors, and pulled back onto the endless highway. The black sedan fell into place behind me, its unearthly headlights illuminating the road ahead. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know when I'll get there. But I know that somewhere out there, at the end of this impossible journey, something is waiting for me. My final destination, my last delivery. And until I reach it, I'll keep driving. Because that's what truckers do. We drive, even if the road never ends. I never meant to become a killer. But out here on the endless highways where the night seems to stretch on forever and the only company is the hum of your engine, it's easy to lose your humanity. I didn't realize the toll my callousness was taking until the night the road itself decided to exact its revenge. It started small, as these things often do. A raccoon here, a possum there, just shadows darting across the asphalt, caught in my headlights for a split second before disappearing under my wheels with a sickening thump. At first, I felt bad about it. I'd wince at each impact, mutter a quiet apology to whatever poor creature I'd just sent to meet its maker. But as the years went by and the miles piled up, I started to change. Maybe it was the loneliness of the long haul, or maybe it was just the gradual hardening of my heart. Whatever the reason, I began to feel a twisted sort of thrill each time I'd nail some unsuspecting critter. I started keeping count like some kind of macabre game. Raccoons were worth 1 point, deer 5. I'd swerve to hit squirrels and chipmunks, laughing as they tried to zigzag away from my 18 wheels of death. It became an obsession, a way to break up the monotony of the endless road. My fellow drivers noticed the change in me. They'd see the fresh blood on my grill, the tufts of fur stuck in my bumper. Some of them started calling me the Butcher on the CB. I wore the nickname like a badge of honor. I should have known it couldn't last. Should have realized that every action has its consequence, that the universe has a way of balancing the scales. But I was too caught up in my sick game to see the signs. It was a moonless night in late October when it all came to a head. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver, pushing hard to make up time after a delay at the loading dock. The highway stretched out before me, empty and dark, illuminated only by my headlights. That's when I saw it, a deer, standing frozen in the middle of the road. A big buck, his antlers silhouetted against the night sky. 5 points, I thought, my foot already moving towards the accelerator. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way the deer was standing, too still, too purposeful. Its eyes caught the light of my high beams, reflecting back at me with an unnatural red glow. For a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw intelligence in those eyes. Awareness, accusation. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. My foot came down on the accelerator, the big diesel engine roaring as I aimed straight for the deer. At the last possible second, the buck moved, not away from my truck as any normal animal would, but towards it. It leapt, sailing over my hood and landing with impossible grace on the roof of my cab. I cursed, swerving wildly as I tried to shake it off, but the deer clung on, its hooves making a horrible screeching sound as they dug into the metal. I could hear it moving above me, pacing back and forth like it was looking for a way in, and then, to my horror, it found one. The deer's head appeared in my driver's side window, antlers smashing through the glass in a shower of shards. I yelled, throwing myself across the seat to avoid being gored. The truck, now completely out of control, careened off the road. I felt the sickening lurch as the wheels left the asphalt, the whole world seeming to tilt as we rolled down the embankment. When the motion finally stopped, I found myself hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. The cab was crushed, trapping my legs. I could smell diesel fuel and something else, something coppery and organic. Blood, I realized. My blood. As my vision swam in and out of focus, I saw movement outside the shattered windshield. At first, I thought it was the deer come to finish me off. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something much, much worse. Animals were emerging from the woods, dozens of them, hundreds, raccoons and possums, squirrels and rabbits, deer and coyotes. But they weren't normal animals. Their bodies were broken and mangled, fur matted with old blood, bones protruding at unnatural angles. Roadkill, I realized with growing horror. Every animal I'd ever hit coming back for their revenge. They approached the truck slowly, their dead eyes fixed on me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, trapped not just by the wreckage of my truck, but by the weight of every life I'd so callously taken. As the undead horde reached my cab, I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something else. A tugging sensation, like I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in my truck anymore. I was standing on the side of a highway, my body whole and uninjured. But something was wrong. My skin felt different, furry. I looked down at my hands only to find paws instead. With dawning horror, I realized what had happened. I had become one of them, a spirit of the road, doomed to haunt the highways I'd once ruled. I've lost track of how long I've been like this. Time doesn't mean much when you're dead, I guess. I roam the roads now along with all the others. We wait for drivers like the one I used to be. The careless ones, the cruel ones, the ones who think the lives they take don't matter. And when we find them, we make sure they learn the lesson I learned too late. That every life has value. That every death has consequence. That the road exacts its toll on all of us one way or another. So the next time you're driving late at night and you see something dart across the road in front of you, think twice before you hit that accelerator. It might just be me or one of my brethren testing you. And if you fail that test, well, there's always room for one more in our ghostly parade. I see a lot of familiar faces out here. Truckers I used to know, drivers I'd pass on the long hauls. They all have the same haunted look in their eyes, the same dawning realization of the harm they've caused. We try to warn the living when we can. We'll run across the road in front of them, hoping they'll swerve or slow down. Sometimes it works. More often it doesn't. And our numbers grow. There's a hierarchy to our spectral society. The smaller animals, the ones who were deemed worthless in life, they're our scouts. They're the ones who dart out first, testing the reflexes and the conscience of the drivers. The deer and the larger animals, we're the enforcers. When a driver fails the test, we're the ones who bring judgment. It's a lonely existence, but not without its moments of satisfaction, I suppose you'd call it. The look on a driver's face when they realize what's happening, when they understand that their actions have consequences. It's almost worth the eternal torment. I often wonder about my family, about the life I left behind. Do they know what happened to me? Did they mourn? Or did they just assume I'd run off, abandon them like so many long-haul drivers do? I hope they're okay. I hope they've found peace. As for me, peace is a distant memory. My days and nights blend together in an endless cycle of waiting and watching, judging and punishing. It's a harsh sentence, but a fair one, I think. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. So if you're reading this, if you're one of those drivers who thinks that little thump in the night doesn't matter, think again. We're out here watching, waiting, and sooner or later we'll be coming for you. Because out here on the endless highways where the night seems to stretch on forever and the only company is the hum of your engine, karma has teeth and antlers and claws, and it never ever forgets. Drive safe, drive kind, and for God's sake, watch out for animals on the road, because you never know which one might be me, giving you your final chance at redemption. They say the loneliest road in America is Highway 50 through Nevada, but I've found a stretch that's lonelier still. It's a winding mountain pass in Colorado where the pines crowd the roadside and the fog rolls in thick as wool. And at the top of that pass is a way station that isn't on any map, run by a woman who isn't quite human. I know because I've met her, and I'm one of the few who's lived to tell the tale. It was supposed to be a routine run, Denver to Salt Lake City, hauling a load of farm equipment. I'd done it a dozen times before, could practically drive it with my eyes closed. But this time was different. This time I took a shortcut. I'd heard rumors about it from some of the old-timers at the truck stop. A winding mountain road that could shave hours off the trip if you were brave enough to take it. They warned me about the hairpin turns, the sheer drop-offs, the lack of guardrails. What they didn't warn me about was her. I hit the road just as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. The road was exactly as treacherous as I'd been told, all blind curves and steep grades. But I'm a good driver, one of the best. I handled it like a pro, even as the darkness deepened and a thick fog began to roll in. It was nearing midnight when I saw the sign looming out of the mist. Way station ahead, all trucks must stop. I frowned, checking my GPS. There wasn't supposed to be a way station up here. Hell, there wasn't supposed to be anything up here. But the sign was clear, and I knew better than to risk bypassing a way station. The fines could be astronomical, and I couldn't afford to lose my commercial license. So I slowed down, peering through the fog for the turnoff. The way station appeared suddenly, materializing out of the mist like something from a dream. It was old, far older than any way station I'd ever seen. The building was made of weathered wood that looked like it had been standing for a century, and the scale itself was an ancient-looking thing of rusted iron. As I pulled onto the scale, I noticed something odd. There were other trucks parked in the lot, but they all looked wrong somehow. Old models, the kind you'd see in a museum, not on a working highway. And they were all empty. No drivers in sight. A cold feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right here. But before I could put the truck in gear and get the hell out of there, I saw her. She emerged from the office, moving with an unnatural grace. At first glance, she looked like any other way station operator, middle-aged, heavy-set, wearing a uniform that had seen better days. But as she got closer, I realized that her proportions were all wrong. Her arms were too long, her fingers tapering into points that looked more like claws than human hands, and her face. God, her face. It shifted as I watched, like it couldn't decide what features to settle on. She approached my window and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. It was like I was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze. "Well, well," she said, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What do we have here? A little mouse lost in the mountains?" I tried to speak, to ask who she was or what she wanted, but no sound came out. She smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp to be human. "Oh, don't worry, little mouse. I'm just here to weigh you, to measure the weight of your soul." She placed one of those claw-like hands on the side of my truck, and suddenly I felt different. Like something was being pulled out of me, stretched and examined. Images flashed through my mind, memories I'd long forgotten. The time I'd lied to get out of a speeding ticket. The married woman I'd had an affair with back in my 20s. The stray dog I'd hit and left dying on the side of the road, too afraid to stop and help. Every sin, every misdeed, every moment of selfishness or cruelty, she pulled them all out and laid them bare. I felt them like physical weights, pressing down on me, threatening to crush me. My, she said, her smile growing wider. "You're carrying quite a load, aren't you? I'm afraid you're well over the limit." Terror gripped me as I realized what she meant. I'd heard stories whispered late at night in truck stops and diners. Stories of drivers who disappeared on lonely mountain roads, their rigs found empty and abandoned. With a Herculean effort, I managed to find my voice. "Please," I croaked. "I'll do anything. Just let me go." She tilted her head, considering. "Anything? That's a dangerous offer, little mouse. Are you sure you want to make it?" I nodded frantically, beyond caring about the consequences. I just wanted to get away, to put this nightmare behind me. "Very well," she said. "I'll let you go, but in exchange you'll carry a piece of me with you. A little passenger, if you will. And whenever you pass this way again, you'll bring me another soul to weigh. Do we have a deal?" I wanted to say no. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to refuse. But I was too afraid, too desperate to escape, so I nodded, sealing my fate with a single damning motion. The witch, for I knew now that's what she was, smiled again, wider than ever. Her jaw seemed to unhinge, opening far wider than any human mouth could, and from it poured a stream of black smoke, forcing its way into my mouth, my nose, my ears. I felt it settle inside me, a cold, writhing presence that made me want to claw at my own skin. And then suddenly it was over. The witch was gone, the way station fading away into the mist as if it had never been there at all. I sat there for a long time, shaking and crying like a child. When I finally pulled myself together enough to drive, I found that hours had passed. The sun was rising, burning away the last of the fog. I made it to Salt Lake City in record time, my cargo intact, but I knew something had changed. I could feel the witch's presence inside me, watching, waiting. In the months that followed, I tried to forget about that night. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. I avoided that mountain pass like the plague, taking the long way around even when it cost me time and money. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Sooner or later, a job would come up that would force me to take that road again. And when it did, I knew what would happen. I'd find myself pulling into that impossible way station, delivering another unsuspecting driver into the witch's clutches. The thought made me sick, but I knew I had no choice. A deal was a deal, and I'd made mine with my eyes wide open. So now I drive the highways with a heavy heart and a heavier soul. I keep to myself, avoiding the easy camaraderie of my fellow drivers, because I know that any one of them could be my next victim, the soul I'll have to sacrifice to keep my infernal bargain. Sometimes, late at night when the road is empty and the moon is high, I think I can hear her laughing, a dry, rasping chuckle that seems to come from inside my own head. And I wonder how many more souls I'll have to deliver before she's satisfied, how many more lives I'll have to destroy to save my own. So if you're ever driving through the mountains of Colorado and you see a way station that isn't on your map, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't stop, no matter what. Because if you do, you might find yourself facing the way station witch. And trust me, that's one encounter you won't walk away from unchanged. As for me, I'm still out here, haunting the highways like a ghost, waiting for the day when I'll have to make that drive again, to deliver another soul to the witch, and hoping against hope that somehow, some way, I'll find a way to break this curse before it's too late. But until then, I'll keep driving. Because out here on the endless road, that's all any of us can do. We drive on, carrying our burdens, our secrets, our sins, and we pray that when our time comes to be weighed and measured, we won't be found wanting. They say you can't put a price on your soul, but I found out the hard way that's not true. Mine cost exactly $15,000, the price I paid for a used Peterbilt with more miles on it than stars in the sky. What I didn't know when I handed over that cashier's check was that I wasn't just buying a truck. I was opening a door to a hell I never knew existed. It all started when my old rig finally gave up the ghost somewhere outside of Tucson. The repair bill was more than the truck was worth, and I was facing the very real possibility of losing my independent operator status. That's when I saw the ad. 2005 Peterbilt 379, low miles, great condition, price negotiable, serious inquiries only. The price listed was way below market value, even for a truck that old. I should have known it was too good to be true, but desperation has a way of blinding you to red flags. I met the seller in a truck stop parking lot just off I-10. He was a wiry old man with eyes that never seemed to blink. The truck itself was a beauty, gleaming black paint, chrome polished to a mirror shine, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "She's a special rig," the old man said, patting the hood like it was a favorite pet. "Needs a special kind of driver. You sure you're up for it?" I laughed it off, too excited by the prospect of getting back on the road to pay much attention to his cryptic words. We haggled a bit, but in the end I got the truck for even less than the asking price. As I signed the title, I could have sworn I saw the old man smirk. "Remember," he said as he handed me the keys, "she's got a mind of her own. Treat her right, and you'll go far. Treat her wrong." He let the sentence hang, then turned and walked away without another word. I shook off the weird feeling and climbed into the cab. The interior was immaculate, not a speck of dust anywhere. As I turned the key, the big diesel engine roared to life with a sound that was almost hungry. The first few runs were uneventful. The truck performed beautifully, eating up miles like they were nothing. I started calling her Black Betty, and found myself talking to her like she could understand me. It wasn't until my third week with the truck that things started to get strange. I was hauling a load of electronics from Dallas to Los Angeles, pushing hard to make up time after a delay at the loading dock. It was late, well past midnight, and I was the only vehicle on a lonely stretch of West Texas highway. That's when I saw the hitchhiker. He appeared out of nowhere, standing on the shoulder of the road. In the split second, my headlights illuminated him. I saw a man in old-fashioned clothes, his face hidden by the brim of a fedora. My first instinct was to stop. It was a dangerous place to be stranded. But as I started to ease off the accelerator, I felt the truck surge forward. The pedal pushed down on its own, the engine roaring as we barreled towards the hitchhiker. I yanked the wheel hard, trying to swerve, but the steering was locked. I watched in horror as we bore down on the man, bracing myself for the impact, but it never came. At the last possible second, the hitchhiker vanished like he'd never been there at all. The truck settled back to its normal speed, the steering loosening in my hands. I pulled over at the next rest stop, my hands shaking so bad I could barely shift into park. What the hell had just happened? Had I fallen asleep at the wheel? Was I hallucinating from too many hours on the road? As I sat there trying to calm my nerves, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was coming from the truck, a low, rumbling chuckle that seemed to emanate from the engine itself. That was just the beginning. Over the next few months, more inexplicable things began to happen. The truck would take detours on its own, turning off onto roads I'd never seen before, roads that didn't show up on any map. We'd drive for hours through impossible landscapes, forests where the trees bled, deserts where the sand whispered in forgotten languages. And always, always there were the hitchhikers, ghostly figures that would appear on the roadside only to vanish under my wheels. Sometimes I'd see their faces in the rearview mirror afterward, twisted in silent screams. I tried to get rid of the truck, tried to sell it, to give it away, even to abandon it. But every time I thought I was free, I'd wake up to find it parked outside my house, engine ticking as if it had just been driven. The worst part was, despite everything, I was doing better than ever. The loads were always ready, the routes always clear. I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. But the cost, God, the cost. I stopped sleeping, afraid of the nightmares that plagued me when I closed my eyes. Visions of endless highways lined with the souls of the damned, of a great black beast devouring everything in its path. I lost weight. My eyes sunk into dark hollows. My family stopped calling. My friends avoided me. But still, I kept driving. It all came to a head on a run through the Rocky Mountains. I was hauling a load that I never saw, never touched. The trailer had been sealed when I picked it up, with strict instructions not to open it under any circumstances. As we climbed a winding mountain pass, a terrible storm broke overhead. Lightning split the sky and rain fell in sheets so thick I could barely see the road. That's when I heard it. A sound coming from the trailer, a pounding, like something was trying to get out. I pulled over against my better judgment and approached the trailer. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. And then I heard voices, countless voices, screaming, pleading, begging to be released. With shaking hands, I broke the seal and threw open the trailer doors. What I saw inside, I still can't describe it. A writhing mass of shadows and light, of faces and forms that hurt my eyes to look at. And in the center of it all, a pair of glowing red eyes that I recognized all too well. It was the truck. Somehow, impossibly, I was looking at the true form of the thing I'd been driving all these months, and it was hungry. I ran like I'd never run before, away from the truck, away from the horrors in the trailer. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing on the rain-soaked asphalt. When I came to, I was in a hospital. They told me I'd been found wandering on the highway, delirious and babbling about demon trucks and damned souls. My rig was nowhere to be found. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I got help, got better, put it all behind me. But the truth is, you don't walk away from something like that. Not really. I don't drive anymore, can't even look at a big rig without breaking into a cold sweat. But sometimes late at night I hear it, the rumble of a diesel engine, the hiss of air brakes. And I know it's out there somewhere, waiting, hungry. So if you're ever out on the highway late at night and you see a black Peterbilt coming up behind you, do yourself a favor, pull over, let it pass. Don't look in your rearview mirror no matter what you hear or what you think you see. Because truck 666 is still out there, still driving, still hungry. And it's always looking for a new driver. As for me, I'm just trying to live with what I've done, with the knowledge of what's really out there on the dark highways of this world. I can't undo the past, can't save the souls I helped condemn, but I can warn others. So that's what I do now. I haunt truck stops and diners, telling my story to anyone who'll listen. Most think I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But if I can stop just one person from making the deal I made, from climbing into that demon-haunted cab, then maybe, just maybe, I can start to make amends. Because out there on the endless highways where the night seems to stretch on forever and the only company is the hum of your engine, there are things waiting in the darkness, things that hunger, things that can offer you everything you've ever wanted. But trust me when I say this, no deal is worth your soul, no truck is worth the price I paid. So drive safe, drive smart, and whatever you do, don't buy a truck named 666. I've been driving trucks for 30 years and I've seen some strange things on the road, but nothing compares to what happened to me last October on Route 87. I still can't explain it, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live. It was a cold, misty night, the kind where the fog clings to your windshield no matter how hard the wipers work. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, pushing to make a deadline in Albany. The coffee from my last stop had long since worn off, and I was fighting to keep my eyes open. That's when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, a lone figure on the side of the road. At first I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer I could see her clearly. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and a green backpack. She was wearing a white sweater and jeans, completely inappropriate for the weather. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's against company policy, and in this day and age you can't be too careful. But something about her made me pull over. Maybe it was the way she was shivering, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Or maybe it was because she reminded me of my own daughter, who's about the same age. As I slowed down, she jogged up to the passenger side. I leaned over and opened the door. "You shouldn't be out here alone," I said. "Where are you headed?" She climbed in, her movements stiff from the cold. "Albany," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for stopping." I nodded and pulled back onto the road. "I'm heading there myself. Should be there in about an hour if this fog doesn't get any worse." She didn't respond, just stared straight ahead. I figured she was exhausted, so I didn't push for conversation. The cab fell into silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the steady swish of the wipers. After a few miles, I glanced over at her. She was still shivering despite the heat blasting from the vents. "There's a blanket behind the seat if you're cold," I offered. She turned to me then, and I nearly swerved off the road. Her face was deathly pale, her lips blue. But it was her eyes that really got me. They were wide and frightened, like a deer caught in headlights. "Are you okay?" I asked, my heart racing. "Do you need me to take you to a hospital?" She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "Just keep driving, please." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Something wasn't right here, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but I kept stealing glances at my passenger. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance. The fog seemed to thicken around us until it felt like we were driving through a cloud. The lights from oncoming traffic were few and far between, each one briefly illuminating her ghostly face. I cleared my throat, desperate to break the eerie silence. "So, what brings you to Albany?" She didn't move, didn't even blink. For a moment I thought she hadn't heard me. But then she spoke, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear it over the engine. "I'm going home," she said. "I've been away for so long." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Where's home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned to look at me again, and this time I swear I saw tears in her eyes. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What do you say to something like that? I focused on the road again, my mind racing. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? And why did I have the overwhelming feeling that I was in way over my head? We drove on in silence for what felt like hours, though my watch told me only 20 minutes had passed. The fog pressed in around us, so thick now that I could barely see 10 feet in front of the truck. I slowed down, squinting into the gloom. Suddenly, she sat up straight, her hand gripping the armrest. "Stop!" she said urgently. "Please, stop here." I looked around, confused. We were in the middle of nowhere, nothing but trees on either side of the road. "Here?" I asked. "But there's nothing." "Please," she repeated, her voice cracking. "I need to get out." Against my better judgment, I pulled over to the side of the road. Before I could even come to a complete stop, she had the door open and was climbing out. "Wait!" I called after her. "At least take the blanket, it's freezing out there." But she was already gone, swallowed up by the fog. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, completely baffled by what had just happened. Then, shaking my head, I put the truck in gear and started to pull away. That's when I saw it in my side mirror. A small wooden cross on the side of the road, barely visible through the mist. My blood ran cold as I slammed on the brakes. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The beam cut through the darkness as I approached the cross. There were flowers at its base, long since wilted, and a small plaque. As I bent down to read it, I felt the world tilt around me. The plaque bore a name, Sarah Thompson, and a date from 5 years ago. But it was the photo that made my heart stop. It was her, the girl I had just dropped off, the girl who couldn't possibly be real. I stumbled back to my truck, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake, a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. As I climbed back into the cab, a piece of white fabric caught my eye. There, on the passenger seat where she had been sitting, was a single white sweater, neatly folded. I don't remember much of the rest of that drive. Somehow I made it to Albany, delivered my load, and checked into a motel. I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. I kept replaying every moment of that ride in my head, looking for some explanation that made sense. In the light of day, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But I couldn't shake the memory of her face, the sound of her voice, the chill of her presence. A week later, driven by a need I couldn't explain, I went back to that stretch of road. The cross was still there, weathered and lonely. I left some fresh flowers and stood there for a long time, unsure of what I was feeling. As I turned to leave, a gust of wind whipped past me, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a thank you. I froze, my heart pounding. But when I looked around, there was nothing but empty road and silent trees. I've never told anyone this story before now. Who would believe me? Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, seeing her pale face and frightened eyes. I've driven that route many times since then, always with a mix of dread and hope. Dread of seeing her again and hope that I will, if only to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But I've never seen her again. And I've never picked up another hitchhiker. Some people say that ghosts are lost souls trapped between this world and the next. Maybe that's what she was. Maybe for one night I helped her find her way home. All I know is the roads are full of mysteries and some of them are better left unsolved. So if you're ever driving down Route 87 on a foggy night and you see a young woman with a green backpack on the side of the road, just keep driving. Some passengers are meant to make their journey alone. The crackle of static from my CB radio usually lulls me to sleep, but that night it jolted me wide awake. Through the white noise, a voice cut through, desperate and clear. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Big Red. I've gone off the road at Dead Man's Curve. My rig's on fire. I need help." I sat up straight in my cab, my heart pounding. Dead Man's Curve was just a few miles ahead, but something about that voice, it sounded familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I've been hauling freight across the country for nearly 3 decades. The open road is my home, and I thought I'd seen it all. But what happened that night on Route 66 shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the thin line between this world and whatever comes after. It was a typical run, nothing special. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to LA, making good time despite the late hour. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway. I'd been driving for about 14 hours straight, fueled by truck stop coffee and the need to meet my deadline. As I approached Dead Man's Curve, I slowed down out of habit. It's a nasty stretch of road that's claimed more than its fair share of truckers over the years. The CB crackled to life again, the same voice even more frantic now. "Please, anybody, I'm trapped. The flames are getting closer. Oh God, help me." I grabbed the mic, my palms sweaty. "This is Night Owl. I hear you, Big Red. I'm about a mile from Dead Man's Curve. Hang tight, I'm coming." There was no response, just more static. I pushed down harder on the accelerator, scanning the roadside for any sign of a wreck. As I rounded the curve, my headlights swept across the landscape, illuminating nothing but empty desert and scrub brush. I frowned, confused. There was no sign of an accident, no flickering flames or twisted metal. I pulled over to the shoulder, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed down from the cab. The night air was cool on my skin as I walked along the edge of the road, searching for any evidence of a crash. "Hello?" I called out. "Big Red, you out there?" Only the whisper of the wind answered me. I was about to give up and head back to my truck when my foot caught on something. I stumbled, shining my flashlight down at the ground. What I saw made my blood run cold. Half buried in the sand was an old CB radio mic, its cord disappearing into the dirt. With shaking hands, I brushed away the grit, revealing more of the cable. It led to a larger piece of twisted metal, unmistakably part of a truck's dashboard. I stood there frozen as the implications sank in. There had been an accident here, all right, but not tonight. This wreckage was old, rusted, and weathered by years of sun and sand. A coyote howled in the distance, snapping me out of my daze. I hurried back to my rig, my mind racing. As I climbed into the cab, the CB crackled once more. "Thank you," the voice said softly. "I've been waiting so long for someone to hear me." I snatched up the mic. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What's going on here?" But there was only static in response. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for accidents at Dead Man's Curve. What I found chilled me to the bone. 20 years ago, almost to the day, a trucker known as Big Red had gone off the road at this very spot. His truck had caught fire, and he'd burned alive before help could arrive. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the empty desert, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really heard the desperate pleas of a man who died 2 decades ago? Or was my exhausted mind playing tricks on me? As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I put my rig in gear and slowly pulled back onto the highway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my world. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I found myself obsessively researching the accident, learning everything I could about the man they'd called Big Red. His real name was Mike Thornton, a veteran trucker with a wife and 2 kids back in Kansas. By all accounts, he'd been well-liked, known for his readiness to help a fellow driver in need. I even tracked down his widow, Sarah, now in her 60s. When I called her, I didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone you might have heard their long-dead husband's ghost? But as soon as I mentioned Dead Man's Curve, she went quiet. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You heard him too, didn't you?" My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Sarah sighed heavily. "Over the years, I've gotten a handful of calls from truckers like you. They all tell the same story. A desperate voice on the CB calling for help from a burning truck. But when they go to look, there's nothing there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why do you think it's happening?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I like to think it's Mike's way of keeping other drivers safe. That curve took him from us. Maybe he's trying to make sure it doesn't claim anyone else." After I hung up, I sat in my idling truck for a long time, mulling over her words. Could it be true? Was Big Red's spirit somehow lingering at the site of his death, warning others of the danger? I'm not much for ghost stories or the supernatural. I've always been a practical man, dealing in the solid realities of diesel engines and delivery schedules. But that night at Dead Man's Curve shook something loose in me. It made me realize that maybe there's more to this world than what we can see and touch. In the months that followed, I found myself paying closer attention to the CB chatter, especially when passing through areas known for accidents. I started keeping a journal, jotting down any odd occurrences or unexplained voices, and I wasn't the only one. Once I started asking around, I discovered a whole network of truckers who'd had similar experiences. There was old Pete, who swore he'd been guided through a whiteout blizzard by the calm instructions of a woman who died in that same storm a year earlier. And Jolene, who claimed the ghost of a child killed in a pileup had appeared in her headlights, warning her of black ice ahead. Were these all just tall tales, the product of too many lonely nights on the road? Or was there something more to it? I couldn't say for sure. But I do know that I drive a little more carefully now, especially around those notorious danger spots. And every time I pass Dead Man's Curve, I slow down and keep an ear on the CB. Sometimes I swear I can hear a faint voice through the static, not calling for help anymore, but offering a simple warning. Be careful out there. I've never told this story to my dispatcher or any of the guys back at the depot. They'd probably think I've gone soft in the head. But I know what I heard that night, and I know I'm not alone. So if you're ever out on the long haul and you hear a strange voice come through on your radio, pay attention. It might just be another trucker passing the time. Or it might be something else entirely, a message from someone who's traveled these roads before, someone who knows the dangers that lurk in the darkness. Because out here on the highway in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, the line between this world and the next gets awful thin. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you might just hear a whisper from the other side, a warning, a plea, or maybe just a reminder that we're all in this together, no matter which side of that line we're on. As for me, I'll keep driving, keep listening, and keep wondering about the mysteries of the open road. Because out here, under the vast starry sky, anything seems possible. Even a voice from beyond, reaching out across the years to make sure we all make it home safe. The moment I signed for that cursed load, my life became a living nightmare. If I'd known then what I know now, I'd have turned that rig around and driven as far away from that decrepit warehouse as my wheels could take me. But hindsight's always 20/20ths, isn't it? And now, as I sit here in this dingy motel room jumping at every shadow, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever be free of the horrors that began with a simple delivery run. It started like any other job. I'd been on the road for 15 years, hauling everything from produce to machinery across the lower 48. This gig seemed straightforward enough. Pick up a load from an old warehouse in upstate New York and deliver it to a private collector in New Orleans. The pay was good, almost too good, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Money's money, right? I pulled up to the warehouse just as the sun was setting. The place looked like it hadn't seen a lick of maintenance since the 50s. Rust-streaked walls, broken windows, and a giant padlock on the main door that looked newer than everything else combined. A wiry old man with wispy white hair and thick-rimmed glasses met me at the gate. His name tag read Curator, but he didn't offer a real name. "You're late," he said, his voice raspy and annoyed. I checked my watch. "I'm right on time, actually." He waved a dismissive hand. "No matter. The cargo's ready. Follow me." As we walked through the warehouse, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Row after row of shelves stretched into the gloom, filled with oddities I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Was that a shrunken head, a jar full of something moving? I shook my head. Trick of the light had to be. The cargo turned out to be a single wooden crate about the size of a large television. It was covered in strange symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphics. "Handle with extreme care," the curator said, his eyes boring into mine. "No matter what, do not open the crate. Do not let it out of your sight. And most importantly, deliver it before midnight 3 days from now." I nodded, trying not to show how unnerved I was. "No problem. That's what you're paying me for, right?" As two burly guys I hadn't noticed before loaded the crate into my trailer, the curator pressed an envelope into my hand. "Your advance, the rest upon delivery." I peeked inside, more cash than I'd ever seen in one place. This was starting to feel less like a delivery and more like something illegal. But I'd already agreed, and that money would go a long way towards paying off my rig. "One last thing," the curator said as I climbed into my cab. "If anything unusual happens during your journey, use this." He handed me a small velvet pouch. Inside was what looked like black salt. Before I could ask what he meant, he'd disappeared back into the warehouse. The big iron gates creaked shut behind me as I pulled onto the road, the sun now fully set and an unseasonable chill in the air. The first couple 100 miles were uneventful. I kept the radio on, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. It was just a box, right? Probably some rich guy's antique or something. But as I crossed into Pennsylvania, things started to get weird. It began with the radio. No matter what station I tuned to, all I got was static punctuated by bursts of what sounded like chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Then came the smell. At first, I thought I'd run over a skunk or something had crawled into my engine and died, but it got worse, a putrid, rotting stench that seemed to be coming from inside the cab. I checked everywhere but couldn't find the source. By the time I hit Ohio, I was a nervous wreck. The smell was overwhelming, and I swear I could hear scratching coming from the trailer. At a rest stop, I did a walk-around, half expecting to see the crate broken open and some monster crawling out. But everything looked normal. As I stood there, a car pulled up next to me. The woman inside rolled down her window, a look of concern on her face. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I must have looked a mess, sweating, pale, wild-eyed. I tried to smile. "Just a long night on the road, thanks for asking." She nodded, not looking convinced. As she drove away, I caught a glimpse of myself in the side mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, dark circles underneath them like bruises. Had I aged 10 years in one night? Back on the road, things got worse. The scratching from the trailer grew louder, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping. The smell was so bad I had to hang my head out the window just to breathe. "Somewhere in Indiana," I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over on a deserted stretch of highway, determined to open that damn crate and face whatever was inside. As I approached the trailer doors, the thumping grew louder. Thump, 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 like a massive heart beating. My hands shook as I unlocked the doors. The moment they swung open, the thumping stopped. The smell vanished. The crate sat there, innocuous as ever, not a scratch on it. I stood there for a long time, my mind reeling. Was I going crazy, hallucinating from lack of sleep? A car sped by, horn blaring, snapping me back to reality. I slammed the trailer doors shut and scrambled back into the cab. The curator's warning echoed in my mind. Do not open the crate. I pressed on, the miles blurring together in a haze of caffeine and terror. Every time I blinked, I saw those strange symbols from the crate burned into my eyelids. The radio alternated between static and that unsettling chant, and always that scratching from the trailer. Somewhere in Tennessee, I realized I was being followed. A black SUV with tinted windows had been behind me for hours, always maintaining the same distance. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. At a truck stop, I tried to lose them. I parked between two other big rigs and waited. The SUV circled the lot twice before parking across from me. Two men in dark suits got out, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the late hour. My heart pounding, I remembered the pouch the curator had given me. With shaking hands, I sprinkled some of the black salt across my dashboard and around the doors of the cab. The men approached, their movements unnaturally smooth, but as they reached my truck, they stopped short as if hitting an invisible wall. They stood there for a moment, heads cocked to the side like confused dogs. Then, in perfect unison, they turned and walked back to their vehicle. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I fired up the engine and tore out of that truck stop like the devil himself was on my tail. The last leg of the journey was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. The scratching had become a constant background noise, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. I saw things moving in my peripheral vision, darting shadows, twisted shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. I made it to New Orleans with hours to spare before the deadline. The delivery address turned out to be an old mansion in the Garden District, all wrought iron and peeling paint. As I pulled up, the front door opened. A tall, thin man in an impeccable suit stepped out, flanked by two massive bodyguards. He smiled as he approached, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Right on time," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I trust your journey was uneventful?" I wanted to laugh hysterically. Uneventful? I'd been through hell and back. But something in his gaze stopped me. This man knew exactly what that crate was capable of. "No problems," I managed to croak out. He nodded, satisfied. "Excellent. My associates will unload the cargo. Your payment is inside." As the bodyguards moved to the trailer, I noticed they were wearing gloves covered in the same symbols as the crate. They handled it with a reverence that sent chills down my spine. The thin man handed me another envelope, heavier than the first. "A bonus," he said, "for your discretion." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I climbed back into my cab, he called out, "One piece of advice, driver, leave New Orleans immediately, and whatever you do, don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I drove non-stop until I crossed the Louisiana state line, only then allowing myself to breathe. It's been 3 days since the delivery. I haven't slept more than an hour at a time. Every noise makes me jump. I've gone through half the minibar trying to calm my nerves. The scratch marks on my arms are new. I don't remember doing it, but I must have. Just like I must have written those symbols all over the motel room walls. There's no other explanation. I know I should leave, get as far away from New Orleans as possible. But every time I try, that chanting starts up in my head, and I swear I can smell that rotting stench again. Whatever was in that crate, I think a part of it is still with me. And I'm terrified of what will happen when it decides to fully wake up. The first thing I noticed when the fog cleared was that all the cars looked wrong. Boxy, old-fashioned things I hadn't seen outside of museums. Then I saw the billboard advertising Coca-Cola for 5 cents, and my blood ran cold. I'd driven into that patch of mist in 2024. Somehow I'd come out the other side in 1952. They say time is like a highway stretching out behind and before us. Well, let me tell you, sometimes that highway has some mighty strange off-ramps. I've been driving 18-wheelers for 25 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for that night on Route 66, when I took an unexpected detour through time itself. It was supposed to be a routine haul, Los Angeles to Chicago, straight shot, 3 days tops. I'd made the run 100 times before. The rig was humming along nicely, and I was making good time despite the late hour. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the empty desert landscape. I just passed through Amarillo, Texas, when I noticed a strange fog rolling in. Now, fog isn't uncommon in these parts, especially at night, but this was different. It was thick and greenish, swirling around my truck like something alive. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. That's when it happened. 1 second I was creeping along at 15 miles per hour, and the next, the fog just vanished, like someone had flipped a switch. I blinked, momentarily blinded by the sudden clarity. And that's when I realized something was very, very wrong. The highway beneath my wheels had changed. Gone was the smooth asphalt I'd been driving on moments before, replaced by a rougher, narrower road. The yellow line down the center was missing, and the shoulders were unpaved. I pulled over, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe I'd dozed off and taken a wrong turn. But as I climbed down from the cab, I knew this was more than a simple navigation error. The air smelled different, cleaner but with an unfamiliar tang. The ever-present hum of distant traffic was gone, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. And the stars. I'd never seen so many stars in my life. It was as if someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I'd check my GPS, call for help, anything. But the screen was dead. Not just out of signal, completely unresponsive. That's when I saw the car approaching. As it got closer, my jaw dropped. It was a Studebaker, not a restored classic, but a brand new 1952 model, gleaming in the moonlight. The driver slowed as he passed, giving me a curious look. I must have been quite a sight, a modern trucker standing next to a rig that wouldn't be invented for another 70 years. As the taillights disappeared into the distance, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. Somehow, impossibly, I'd traveled back in time. I don't know how long I stood there trying to wrap my head around what had happened. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Eventually, the chill of the desert night snapped me out of my daze. I had to do something, had to move. I climbed back into my truck, my modern sanctuary in this alien world. The familiar hum of the engine as I turned the key was comforting, even if it felt wildly out of place. I pulled back onto the road, heading east. Maybe if I could find that fog again, I could drive back through to my own time. But as the miles ticked by, there was no sign of the mysterious mist. Instead, I found myself approaching a small town. The neon sign welcomed me to Millsville, Pop 2500. I'd driven this route countless times, and I'd never heard of Millsville. Then again, in my time, it probably didn't exist anymore. I parked on the outskirts of town, killing the engine. I couldn't risk driving into town in my obviously futuristic truck. As I sat there trying to figure out my next move, exhaustion hit me like a wave. I'd been driving for hours before, whatever this was happened, and the shock of my situation had drained what little energy I had left. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But one look at my surroundings confirmed the impossible truth. I was still in 1952. Hunger and the need for a bathroom finally forced me out of the truck. I grabbed some cash from my wallet, hoping it would pass muster in this time, and started walking towards town. Millsville looked like something out of an old movie. Men in fedoras and women in poodle skirts strolled down clean, tree-lined streets. A group of kids on bicycles raced by, laughing. Everyone seemed so carefree. It was a far cry from the fast-paced, technology-driven world I'd left behind. I found a small diner and slipped into a booth, trying not to draw attention to myself. The waitress, a friendly middle-aged woman named Dot, didn't seem to notice anything odd about me as she took my order. I guess jeans and a flannel shirt were timeless enough not to raise suspicion. As I sipped my coffee, only 10 cents a cup, I overheard snatches of conversation from the other patrons. They were talking about the Korean War, which was still raging in this time. Someone mentioned President Truman, and another person was excitedly discussing the latest episode of I Love Lucy. It was surreal, like being in a living history museum. But the food was real enough, and so was the change Dot gave me from my modern dollar bill. Thankfully, the design hadn't changed much in 70 years. After breakfast, I wandered the town, trying to blend in while keeping an eye out for anything that might help me get back to my own time. But the more I explored, the more I realized how out of my depth I was. Everything was different. The technology, the culture, even the way people spoke. I ended up in the town library, poring over maps and local history books, looking for any mention of strange phenomena or unexplained events. The librarian, a young woman named Betty, was curious about my interest, but didn't pry too much. I spun a story about being a writer researching for a novel. As the day wore on, I began to panic. What if I couldn't find my way back? What would happen to my family, my job, my life in 2024? Would I be stuck here, forced to live out the rest of my days in a time before I was even born? Just as despair was starting to set in, I overheard two old men talking in hushed tones near the back of the library. They were discussing something called the Devil's Detour, apparently a stretch of highway just outside of town where strange things were known to happen. My heart raced as I listened. They spoke of people going missing, of cars breaking down for no reason, of strange lights in the sky. One of them even mentioned his cousin who swore he'd driven into a fog one night and come out in a place he didn't recognize, where everything seemed wrong. This had to be it. My way back home. I thanked Betty for her help and hurried out of the library. The sun was setting as I made my way back to my truck, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Millsville. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached my rig, I found a man standing next to it, examining it with obvious fascination. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Interesting vehicle you have here," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I don't believe I've ever seen its like before." I stammered out some excuse about it being a prototype, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "There's no need for that," he said. "I know you're not from here, or rather, not from now." My mouth went dry. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone who can help you get back where you belong, but first we need to talk about why you're here and what you've seen on the other side." As the last light faded from the sky, I realized my journey through time was far from over. In fact, it seemed it was just beginning. The first time my GPS told me to turn left into a cemetery, I laughed it off as a glitch. The second time, when it whispered the name of my dead wife, I nearly drove off the road. By the third time, when it started revealing dark secrets about the town I was passing through, I realized I was dealing with something far beyond a simple navigation error. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Lonely nights on endless highways, strange roadside attractions, and the occasional oddball passenger. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful cross-country run last summer. It started innocently enough. My regular GPS unit had finally given up the ghost after years of faithful service, so I splurged on one of those fancy new models with all the bells and whistles. Voice-activated real-time traffic updates, the works. The salesman assured me it was top of the line, guaranteed to never let me down. If only I'd known then how wrong he was. The first leg of my journey from Seattle to Miami was uneventful. The new GPS worked like a charm, its soothing female voice guiding me effortlessly through cities and back roads alike. I even named her Samantha, after my late wife. It felt nice to have a familiar voice keeping me company on those long, lonely stretches of highway. It was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska when things started to get weird. I was cruising down I-80, nothing but cornfields as far as the eye could see, when Samantha's voice crackled to life. "Turn left in 500 feet, she said. I frowned. There was no left turn coming up, just more highway stretching to the horizon. "There's no turn here, Samantha," I said, feeling a little foolish for talking to a machine. "Turn left now," she insisted, her voice taking on an uncharacteristic edge. Curious, I glanced to my left. There, almost hidden by the tall corn, was a narrow dirt road. I'd driven this route a dozen times and never noticed it before. A chill ran down my spine. "No thanks," I muttered, pressing on down the highway. For the next hour, Samantha remained silent. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing when her voice came back, softer this time. "John," she said, "Sarah says hello." My blood ran cold. Sarah was my wife's name. She'd passed away 5 years ago. There was no way this machine could know that. "What did you say?" I demanded, my voice shaking. But Samantha had gone quiet again, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the endless Nebraska night. By the time I reached Iowa, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But as I approached the outskirts of Des Moines, Samantha spoke up again. "Caution," she said, her voice unnaturally deep. "You are entering a town with a dark history." I snorted. "What are you now, a tourist guide?" "In 1957, the mayor of this town murdered his entire family and buried them in the basement of the city hall," Samantha continued, ignoring my sarcasm. "Their spirits still haunt the building to this day." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This was getting too weird. I reached to turn off the GPS, but before I could, Samantha's voice changed again, becoming almost childlike. "The playground on 5th Street is built on an old Indian burial ground. The children who play there sometimes see ghostly figures watching them from the trees." "Stop it," I growled, jabbing at the power button. But it was like the device had a mind of its own. No matter what I did, Samantha kept talking, her voice cycling through different tones and accents as she spilled the town's darkest secrets. I gunned the engine, desperate to get through Des Moines as quickly as possible. As I passed the city limits sign, Samantha fell silent once more, leaving me shaken and drenched in cold sweat. For the next few days, I drove in tense silence, jumping at every crackle of static from the GPS. But Samantha behaved herself, offering nothing but normal routing instructions. I started to relax, telling myself it had all been some sort of bizarre malfunction. Then I hit Tennessee. It was a little after midnight, and I was navigating the winding roads of the Smoky Mountains. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the world outside my headlights pitch black. That's when Samantha's voice returned, soft and ominous. "John," she whispered, "they're waiting for you just around the next bend." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's waiting?" I asked against my better judgment. "The ones you couldn't save," Samantha replied. "The ones who died because you were too slow." Images flashed through my mind. A terrible pileup I'd witnessed years ago. The faces of the people I couldn't pull from the wreckage before the flames engulfed them. I'd never told anyone about that day, not even Sarah. How could this machine know? "You're not real," I muttered, more to myself than to the GPS. "You're just a malfunctioning piece of electronics." Samantha laughed, a chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Oh, John, I'm as real as the guilt you carry, as real as the secrets you keep." I'd had enough. In a panic, I grabbed the GPS unit and tried to yank it free from its mount. But the moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. I yelped, swerving on the dark road. "You can't get rid of me that easily," Samantha taunted. "I'm part of you now. I know everything you know, everything you've seen, every dark thought, every hidden desire." For the next hour, Samantha's voice was a constant presence, alternating between whispered threats and recitations of things no one but me could possibly know. My deepest fears, my most shameful secrets, she laid them all bare. I was on the verge of a breakdown when I saw the lights of a truck stop ahead. I pulled in, practically falling out of my rig in my haste to get away from that demonic device. The fluorescent glare of the truck stop was a harsh contrast to the darkness I'd been driving through. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. When I looked in the mirror, I hardly recognized the wild-eyed, pale-faced man staring back at me. "Get a grip," I told my reflection. "You're just overtired. It's not real." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Something was very, very wrong with that GPS. Something I couldn't explain or understand. I bought the strongest coffee they had and sat in a booth trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't keep driving with that thing in my truck, but I was only halfway through my run. If I didn't deliver on time, I'd lose my job. And how could I explain this to my boss? He'd think I'd lost my mind. As I sat there, wrestling with my options, I overheard two other drivers talking in the next booth. They were swapping stories about strange things they'd experienced on the road, inexplicable lights in the sky, stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever, mysterious hitchhikers that vanished into thin air. I found myself drawn into their conversation, and before I knew it, I was telling them about Samantha. To my surprise, they didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, they exchanged knowing looks. "Sounds like you've got yourself a haunted GPS, friend," one of them said. "It happens sometimes. The roads have a way of collecting things, memories, emotions. sometimes even souls. How do I get rid of it? I asked, desperately. The older of the two drivers, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, leaned in close. There's a place about 100 miles east of here, calls itself an electronic recycling center, but those in the know understand it's much more than that. They deal with special cases, things that don't behave the way they should. He scribbled an address on a napkin and handed it to me. Tell them old Joe sent you. They'll know what to do. I thanked them, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. As I walked back to my truck, I steeled myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. Sure enough, the moment I turned the key, Samantha's voice filled the cab. Where are we going, John? Somewhere fun, I hope. I know all the best places to hide a body. I gritted my teeth and pulled out of the truck stop, following the directions the old driver had given me. For hours, Samantha taunted and teased, revealing secrets about every town we passed through, every driver we shared the road with. It was maddening, but I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. Finally, just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, I saw it, a nondescript warehouse in the middle of nowhere with a small sign that simply read, E-Recycling. As I pulled into the lot, Samantha's voice took on a note of panic. John, don't do this. We've been through so much together. I'm the only one who truly knows you, who understands you. For a moment, I hesitated. As terrifying as this experience had been, there was a part of me that had grown accustomed to Samantha's presence, to not being alone with my thoughts. But then I remembered Sarah, my real wife, and all the normal human connections I'd been avoiding since her death. It was time to rejoin the land of the living. Goodbye, Samantha, I said, pulling the GPS unit free. This time there was no electric shock, no resistance. It was as if whatever had possessed the device had finally accepted its fate. I walked into the warehouse, the GPS clutched in my hands like a cursed artifact. An old woman greeted me, her eyes twinkling with understanding. Old Joe sent me, I said. She nodded, taking the GPS from me. We'll take care of this for you, honey, and remember, the road may be long and dark, but it's the journey that matters, not the voice telling you where to go. As I walked back to my truck, I felt lighter than I had in years. The open road stretched out before me, full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the journey ahead, wherever it might lead me.